Markham, as I say, former police chief in the Met Police. Peter, hello to you. When you see a headline like this front page of the Times on Friday that says failing police rumbled by weary public, what actually goes through your mind?
Despair at the HMIC putting out yet another report that blames the police for something that everybody knows they can't do, as if it's their fault, as if they're lazy, incompetent or whatever, when the truth of the matter is they have been cut to the bone and beyond over the last nearly a decade now. They cannot cope, everybody knows they cannot cope, and yet the HMIC persist in putting out reports that imply that it's down to the police being incompetent and lazy. It isn't. And despair also that the media, especially the Tory-leaning media, rather than criticise the Tory government that made the situation what it is, that would rather blame the police. It's victim blaming on a massive scale.
Do you think there are, before we turn to the politicians, do you think there are problems within the police that are, as it were, their responsibility rather than the government's?
Oh, the police service is by no means perfect, and it never has been, and it probably never will be, because it operates in a really complex and ever-changing environment. There are always priorities that are constantly changing. I mean, we've seen it over the last few decades with all sorts of things that the police have been slow to pick up on. The child sexual exploitation stuff, for instance, they were slow to pick up on that. And when crime changes and when things change, yes, mistakes are made, but they are all put totally in the shade by the impact of the cuts.
I mean, to be fair to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, I think their Chief Inspector, Matt Parr, in this piece in the Times, he did point out that the police were doing a reasonable job. He said, our judgment is that forces are doing all they can reasonably be expected to do. There's a separate, bigger question about whether we are, as a society, prepared to tolerate a situation in which so much volume crime is not effectively investigated. And he said that is a complex, difficult question, but continuing performance of figures like that chip away at public confidence in the police and may well be part of the reason for the abandonment of victim support, that's for prosecutions, that we have referred to.
He's absolutely right in that. And the Inspectorate regularly in these reports will have lines to that effect within the report somewhere. My problem with them is usually the way that they spin it when they put it out to the media, the way they focus on the highlights, the phraseology they use in some of the interviews they do. If you dig around into the report, sometimes they will acknowledge, quite often they will acknowledge that there are deeper issues at stake there. But the difficulty with them is that their head, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary, is Tom Windsor, who was a Tory government placeman, put in against all precedents. He was put in with directions by Theresa May to regulate and to get a grip of the police service. So he will not bite the hand that feeds him. It's as simple as that. And so even when those words are there, and they're quite right, they're not given the precedence and the importance they deserve when these sorts of reports come out.
What do you think is the government's role here?
The government's role is actually deciding whether, as the inspector said, they're willing to accept the provision of pathetically useless policing because there are no police to do all the routine tasks that the public expect. And it would appear that we have a government, some of the things they've said since Boris Johnson took over sound different, but broadly speaking, we are still in the same position. The government, certainly over the last 9 years, has accepted that the police service will be unable to deliver the things that the public demand, and quite rightly demand. The public want to see police officers in their communities. They want a police presence in their communities, symbolised by police stations in their communities. They want to see the police responding to their calls for assistance. They want to see their crimes, their burglaries, their motor vehicle crimes, and all the routine and high volume stuff investigated. They want to see the bad guys put in front of the courts, and they want the courts to be putting them in prison if they are persistent or serious offenders. They are getting none of this, and yet the government seems to just be quite relaxed to allow it to happen.
This chap, Matt Parr, you're quite right, he's not the most senior figure in the inspectorate, but he is a senior figure. He says that there is a shortage, or there was a shortage of detectives, and he's warned of cases where officers with little experience were dealing with serious offences. Police also struggling to investigate more complex crimes involving the gathering of digital material.
Yeah, all of these things are interlinked. Windsor was also responsible for driving a coach and horses through officers' pay and conditions. So we've got a situation where pay and conditions aren't the best in the world. The government also destroyed morale of middle and senior serving officers, longer serving officers, by changing the goalposts on their pension arrangements. Now, hopefully the court cases are working through and that will be repaired, but it's had a damaging effect on morale. We've got training issues. If you haven't got enough officers to deliver policing, you're going to have to cut your training. You can't have them doing more training when you haven't got them doing any operational policing. So all of these things that are happening, and over the last 10 years, the need for far more detailed, extensive training around digital stuff, around disclosure, around various other things, all of those needs have just not been met, and they all come back to not having enough time to do everything. We have had, over the last decade, changes of policing that needed more police officers trained to a higher standard. We've got fewer police officers trained to a lower standard, and that can't be right.
Do you buy Boris Johnson's assertion that he's going to pump in 20,000 new officers? I mean, it takes time, of course, to train these people up.
It does. He has said it for some time. When he first said it, he said it was going to be over 3 years. I and others pointed out right from the start that if you want to increase the number of police officers over a period of 3 years by 20,000, you're going to have to recruit about 40 or 45,000, because during that 3 years, 20 will leave anyway. That now seems to be being recognised. We also pointed out that if you want to do that, you've got huge logistical issues. Just the practical stuff, where you're going to put them, seeing as all the police stations have been sold off. But who's going to do the training? All the officers that would have been doing the training, loads of them have left. Lots of them are driving trains now. I'm hearing quite regularly of officers in their 2-year probationary period acting as mentors to officers that are a few months behind them. So we've got literally the blind leading the blind. We've got learner police officers being mentors to even more junior learner mentors. This is a recipe for utter disaster. Now, it needs major, major surgery. It doesn't need just kind words and faffing around with, oh, well, we might give you the money for 6 hours. It's got to be fundamental and systematic. I'm not seeing that. I'm hearing the words, but I'm not seeing that. So I'm reserving judgment on whether Johnson will actually deliver what he says he will deliver.
And this cuts right to the heart of the social contract, doesn't it? If we don't feel confident that if we are burgled or our car is broken into or whatever it is going to be sorted out and the perpetrators stand a good chance of being held to account, well, then society starts to crumble, doesn't it? And I don't think that's an exaggeration. Maybe you do.
It's not an exaggeration at all. Again, it's something we've warned of for some time. The vigilantism is starting to show green shoots around the place. Now, vigilantism is not a good thing. Vigilantes get it wrong. They deal with things outside any sort of formal structure. It might make people feel better that if someone gets a kick in for having done something wrong, but it's no way to run a society, certainly not in 2020.
And it's criminal, of course.
Of course it's criminal. But it's going to be encouraged if people know that the police service are unlikely or unable to be able to get to investigate those things. And that's more going to be the case around the persistent offenders doing small-scale drug dealing on the streets and nicking stuff from cars and whatever, which aren't going to be getting the attention now, rather than the more serious things, which the police do prioritise, and with the scarce resources they've got, they do still get a hold of.
Do you think this is a very varied picture around the country from what you know, with your ear to the ground, such as it is?
It's very much a varied picture because the cuts have had a very varied impact. Forces all started, there's 43 forces around the country. They all started from a different position. Some had plenty of officers to do what they were doing. Some were short anyway. Some of them get a lot of their funding from central grant. Some of them get relatively little from central grant and get most from local sources of funding. So forces like Surrey, for instance, have been less impacted by the cuts to central grant than others have. And so the impact on forces has been very, very different. Some forces have lost about 25% of their officers on the street. Some have lost far less. Some have decided that they'll, like the Met, some have had lots of estate to sell off, so they've sold police stations off, and that has impacted and prevented too many cuts. Some have decided to cut police support staff or PCSOs. Some have cut the PCSOs entirely. And so each one has done it slightly differently, so the impacts are very different.
So just very finally, in a couple of sentences, to sum up, what would Peter Kirkham's recipe for turning this around swiftly be?
There's no way to turn it around swiftly. That is just logistically not possible. The only way of turning it around is get everybody involved in policing. That's chief constables, that's the National Crime Agency, the inspectorate, everybody involved in policing, to sit down, work out exactly where we are now, and then work out how to get people back, first of all, to where they were in 2010 or where they needed to be in 2010, and then work out how to do that as practically quickly as possible. But it's going to need some very, very impactive changes. It's going to need special training courses, training centres set up. It's going to need a huge amount of time and effort. The quickest way of making an impact is to recruit ex-officers who can come in and do things without much training to free up serving officers to do other stuff.
Peter Kirkham, thank you very much.
Thank you.